This review was filmed during the 2023 WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes. Without the labor of the writers and actors currently on strike, the works being covered here wouldn't exist. I fully support the WGA and SAG-AFTRA in their fight for fair treatment and compensation against a system that continually denies them such. While a full boycott has not been called for, SAG-AFTRA has asked that everyone who does media about film and TV refrain from promoting struck content during this time. From what I can tell based on guidelines they have released, independent reviews do not constitute promotion of a work, but critical assessment of said work of art. Any praise that I give to these works during this video should be seen as praise purely for the artists, writers, and actors who created it. If anything, the praise is emphasizing that the writers, actors, and other artists deserve more compensation because they are who make these works possible. Additionally, this video was not made using any studio-provided screeners or materials. Do not support any studios during the strike. You know, I kind of wish this show had just ended with a big, explodey, punchy fight like all MCU TV shows end with. And don't get me wrong, this episode does have that, but oh boy, does it have so much more, and none of it good. None of it. Hello, interwebs, and welcome to my review of the series finale, thank God, of MCU's Secret Invasion, this episode titled Home. And oh boy, do we have a lot to talk about with this series finale, and it's going to get, I'm going to be very honest with you, pretty dicey in terms of the things that we're going to have to discuss, because this show brings up some very potent and very specific political imagery that I do not think it had any semblance of a coherent thing to say with the very charged imagery that it brings in this episode, and I think honestly in a way that is very clearly trying to set up for whatever they're going to do with the Skrulls later on down the line, potentially in the Marvels, but I think sets it up in a way that I think is I'm gonna be frank, kind of gross in what they do to get us there. So that is going to get very political in just a moment, but we'll get there. Let's start off with something a little bit easier to talk about when it comes to MCU series finales, and that's the fact that we got a big explodey punchy fight here between Gaia and Gravik. And this is nothing new for MCU TV shows. I mean, every single MCU show from WandaVision to, you know, Miss Marvel, where it's just two people of the same power sets punching each other out, and, you know, the rest of the, you know, story and plot sort of gets put to the wayside as they punch each other out. We get that here. And the difference here is like, oh, Gaia and Gravik become super Skrulls and they have all the powers of the different Avengers. And I think we're supposed to get some level of like, ooh, look, they're using Drax's ability here and they're using, you know, Captain Marvel's ability here. But for me, it's just the same explodey punchy fight and I got really nothing out of it. So maybe for someone that'll do something a lot for them, saying like, oh, look, they're using Mantis's ability at this moment. For me, I found it kind of lackluster. But it's kind of par for the course for Marvel at this point. That's not saying it's good, and actually it's kind of bad, but it's also not unexpected in terms of this show. Let's start getting into a little bit more dicier territory, but not the most diciest yet, because y'all, I have many thoughts about this. But let's start off with I think one of the biggest glaring you know, on the surface problems with this episode is that we finally do get the confrontation between Nick Fury and Gravik, but the reveal is that it's not actually Nick Fury, it is Gaia pretending to be Nick Fury, which already on its face dilutes the potential power of this final confrontation between our two, you know, lead protagonists and antagonists that throughout the show, and you know, on some level, it does make sense that, you know, Gaia should have the final confrontation with Gravik, considering that the two of them have had more scenes together. But ultimately, the ideological difference between these two characters has never been as strong as, like, Nick Fury and Gravik's differences. And frankly, we don't really get any scenes. I can't even think of any scene that we get between Gravik and Nick Fury now. And so this final scene where we're supposed to sort of have Nick Fury finally own up to his mistakes with Gravik, saying, I used you as a child soldier, that whole thing, it loses all of its potency with it being said through Gaia, and then also takes away from Gaia's potential ability to talk to Gravik, and ultimately reminds us that Gaia really didn't have much of a personality to begin with when it came to her differences with Gravik's ideology. But if we are to take on its face, though, Nick Fury as Gaia, his conversation with Gravik, and sort of take that as the show's sort of like, finalization of this ideological difference between these two. I have a major problem with how Nick Fury sort of frames his differences with Gravik, in that Nick Fury says like, oh, well, what I learned is that, Earth was the best home for you. So I was just trying to have you all just stay here long enough until you realize that it takes some time to change hearts and minds. And I'm just like, so what you're telling me, Nick Fury, is your plan was to take advantage of these refugees, not tell them, just string them along endlessly until they just, accepted their situation, and not actually letting them have a chance to actually find a place of their own, but having to assimilate into this society, by the way, that you force your wife to not look like herself and not be herself within, and hide their own culture and their own sense of identity. So yeah, you are in the wrong here, and it's fucked up. And the show sort of presenting that as like, oh yeah, this was his like he was trying to show them that Earth was the right place for them, is a little messed up. It does get potentially complicated by stuff that happening down the line that maybe says that Nick Fury was a little bit wrong in thinking that, but the show doesn't really fully grapple with that, and just sort of like leaves it out in the open in a way that it feels really undercooked, especially when compared to Gravik, who I've already spoken about, is like, he has a rightful grievance for Nick Fury for the exact things that I just said. As a refugee, is like, we deserve to be ourselves, but he is undermined by what Marvel always does, which is make these sort of characters with understandable grievances become like, I'm willing to commit a genocide back at you in order to, fight back. And it's just ultimately this ability that often Marvel narratives, but a lot of sort of, neoliberal type of narratives become, which is trying to reaffirm the status quo by sort of painting people who wish to change the status quo to make things better for a marginalized group as these, hyper-violent genociders who just want to do the same to the people, or worse, to the people who have harmed them. That ultimately, again, just upholds the status quo and denies the ability for there to be any change, because, and in fact, creates negative change, as we see later on this episode. So all of that stuff with Nick Fury and Gravik just completely is just incoherent nonsense, I feel like, in a very frustrating way. But then this brings me to what is going to be my biggest discussion here, and that is with the way things go down with the President of the United States. So let's start off with the climax of the show, in that we have the President of the United States, who is very clearly made to be a Trump analog. We'll get to that more specifically later on, but is very clearly made to be a Trump analog. And he is being argued, Rhodey's arguing with him, is like, you need to attack Russia, and this girl arguing that it might be a false flag operation. She's out there. She knows, these are weird theories. And I'm just like, Rhodey, you would have to prove to this man who might be committing starting World War III that it was Russia, instead of just going off of like, oh yeah, it's definitely Russia, trust me. Like, and my first thought when I saw this argument from Rhodey, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, maybe Trump would believe that, would just go off of like instinct, and then, but like, any president who has any grain of thought, and I'm not saying I love the presidency, but any president would be like, no, maybe give me some proof before I potentially start World War III here. That being said, they can clearly make him Trump, so it's like, okay, I guess that works, that he would be that dumb. And this sort of resolution of the president being like swayed by Nick Fury being like, calm down, we'll take a moment and think about it. It is like the reasonable tact to go, and it just ultimately feels underwhelming, where Nick Fury's like, hey, do what any normal person would do and be like, wait a minute before maybe starting World War III, instead of just pushing the button right now. It just feels like a very underwhelming end to that conflict. But then this leads to, I think, what the goal of this sequence was, which, and I want to be very careful with this, because this is where I'm gonna really have to talk about this. But I'm gonna have to be very careful. What it appears to me that the show was trying to do in its final few moments was set up a status quo for whatever they're gonna do with the Skrulls next. I'm assuming in the Marvels, that movie, but setting up for whatever they're going to do with the Skrulls next, that the Skrulls are on Earth and being hunted down and are being viewed as, refugees often are, and viewed as parasites, viewed as not wanted people, are being genocided and killed. Right? We've seen this narrative of, immigrants being framed this way over and over and over again. Recently in the United States, President Trump himself called immigrants from Mexico, they're like drug dealers and parasites and all that jazz. There's a history of Jewish people being treated that way in the United States as well, and elsewhere, refugees everywhere. Like, this is a common rhetoric. And I think that that's what the show was trying to do to set up for the Marvels, which is to have the Skrulls have be a hunted down refugee cast. So I get that as the status quo that they are setting up for whatever comes next, and doing it in this TV show. So it's a sort of like, if you watched the next movie, you could kind of assume that this is what happened. But if you caught the Secret Invasion show, oh, you understand how they got there. The problem is the way they choose to do that is Nick Fury tells the president of the United States, essentially an anti-Semitic / QAnon conspiracy theory. The president learns that that is correct, stokes his base to kill leaders in charge of countries, saying that there is a deep state of these, secret people ruling the government, in very clear imagery that is evoking, the January 6th insurrection. Like, there is a shot where, people come into a Fox News, CNN style news report area. They're wearing red hats and they gun down a man and one of the newscasters. And it turns out, hey, they're right. He is a Skrull. And the show tries to make this angle from Nick Fury that, like, oh, you're a one-term president. And it's very clearly evoking that this president is Trump. And is trying to say, oh, this is bad. Nick Fury wags his finger at you, Donald Trump allegory. For shame, we'll come and get you. This is a one-term president type of stuff. And I think the show is trying to make a statement that, January 6th was bad and Trump was bad. The problem is that that the show is saying that the president believes these QAnon conspiracy theories, and actually these QAnon type conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, like lizard people running the government and running the news media, actually has validity, and that the rioters that he is stoking can physically see that there are lizard people running the government and the news media. So kind of saying that anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are correct. And I think the show wants to say on some level that, hunting down refugees, hunting down an entire group of people, saying that they are alien combatants when there's civilians that are just trying to live their daily lives is wrong. But the fact that we never get to see civilian Skrulls, we only get to see the, people in power getting murdered. So we only get to see physically this anti-Semitic QAnon conspiracy theory being proven correct by the show, in the eyes of these January 6th style rioters. And so it creates this, again, incoherent mess where I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that the show was saying, hey, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are correct. But it is trafficking in those conspiracy theories to set up this narrative of, hey, refugees are bad, but also they might be doing conspiracy theories. It's a incoherent mess that leans into justifying anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and uses the imagery of January 6th and QAnon conspiracy theories. It's not just anti-Semitic, but QAnon and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories dovetail quite a lot. And using that imagery to make it politically charged, but in a way that I think is very, I'm just going to say, very gross, frankly. And I don't think that was I don't want to sit here and make the claim that, the writers of Secret Invasion are anti-Semitic. What I am saying is they used these types of, themes and storylines in a very haphazard way, a very negligent way, that I think is really gross to be putting out in a Marvel property where it gets seen by a bunch of people. And never to say Marvel movies were the most progressive things ever in terms of their, actual politics. And not their SJW woke agenda politics. Their actual, if you look at what they're saying. I've never said they're super progressive by any means, unless you're the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. But this specifically just traffics in some of the, I think, most insidious stuff and wants to think that it's saying something cogent, but actually says something incoherent in a way that I think can be taken in very dark ways. I don't know what else to say about that. I know there's going to be some of you out there watching this review being like, Jesse, you're reading too much into this. Jesse, you're thinking too hard about it. But this is my job as a critic. And I want to be frank, I personally find this kind of grossly offensive. And, I'm assuming the Marvel's movie will just go with, hey, they're refugees being attacked and hunted down, and won't really touch upon the, Secret Invasion aspect of this stuff with, they were controlling our government aspect, which is for the better. Do not place that in front of, your big movie. I assume this movie, the Marvels, will just be there are refugees being hunted down by the government. That's bad. And I think that would be perfectly fine. Like, if they just showed that, if you just see the Marvels, I think that is a perfectly fine storyline to go with, and follows from, Captain Marvel very well. But the added context that this show gives to that, I think, is gross. And frankly, it really bothers me. And like I said, I know some of you will think I'm overreading into it, but yeah, I don't know what else to say. Frankly, I find this episode offensive. Not for me, because I'm not Jewish, but as someone, nor am I a refugee, but as someone who is a marginalized person who is being attacked in the United States right now, I do feel some affinity for, how all these things interconnect with each other. So I'm not offended for anybody, but I find this episode kind of offensive. And we'll leave it there. I don't think I have much more to say about it. I hate being like, I'll end there. I hate being this person. I don't want to be this person that's like, this is gross. I'm not making a rant here. I'm just looking at what's in front of me and being like, this is what it's trafficking in. And I find it kind of gross. All right. Well, Secret Invasion. What do you think about it? Hopefully you found something that you liked in it. And I will say there are some nice moments between, I didn't even talk about Nick Fury and his wife. There's some nice moments between the two of them. I guess it's cool that Nick Fury's now gotten over his prejudice towards his wife and would like her to be herself in front of him. That dovetails into that whole bit, weirdly. Like, I wish the show had been about that, like Nick Fury coming to accept his wife in her own skin, and that was like the big prejudice for him to go over. But it's not really even framed as that big a deal in the show. Anyways, I'm backtracking. It's a fine arc, but not well displayed in the show, and with everything else, it's given a weird context. Your thoughts? Love them. Live long and prosper, everybody. Take care of yourselves. I am very sorry.